The United States, a global superpower, a beacon of democracy, and a country loved and hated in equal measure. But behind the smiling handshakes and flashy diplomacy lies a truth few talk about. Across continents, in quiet protests and fiery speeches, hatred toward the U.S. simmers, shaped by war, politics, power, and pride. Why do some nations despise America? Today, we dive into 10 countries that openly or quietly hate the United States, and more importantly, why. The answers will surprise you. Warning: stay until the end. The last country may change how you see U.S. foreign policy forever. Let's begin. Number 1. Iran. Iran's hostility toward the United States is deeply rooted in decades of political betrayal, military confrontation, and cultural opposition. The real tension began in 1953, when the CIA orchestrated a coup to overthrow Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh. Why? Because he nationalized Iran's oil, a move that threatened Western interests. That single act led to decades of US-backed authoritarian rule under the Shah, which fueled anger and resentment among the Iranian people. When the 1979 Islamic Revolution overthrew the Shah, the U.S. became the symbolic enemy, and the hostage crisis at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran sealed that perception. Since then, America's economic sanctions, military threats, and support for Iran's regional rivals like Israel and Saudi Arabia have only deepened the animosity. For many Iranians, the U.S. represents imperialism and hypocrisy, preaching freedom abroad while stifling it through force. The hatred isn't just political, it's generational. Number 2. North Korea. North Korea's hatred toward the United States is institutionalized. It's part of the national ideology. The roots go back to the Korean War, 1950 to 1953, where the U.S. dropped more bombs on North Korea than in the entire Pacific during World War II. Entire cities were flattened. Civilians were devastated. North Korean leaders, especially the Kim dynasty, never forgot, and they made sure the people didn't either. Every child in North Korea is raised to believe that the United States is the enemy. Propaganda posters depict Americans as monsters. State-run news blames America for famine, sanctions, and instability. But beyond ideology, there's fear. The U.S. military presence in South Korea and its constant demands for denuclearization are seen by Pyongyang as threats to its survival. In the eyes of North Korea, the U.S. isn't just a foreign adversary. It's the villain in their national story. Number 3. Venezuela. The United States and Venezuela once had decent ties, especially during the oil boom of the 1990s. But everything changed with the rise of Hugo Chavez. Chavez, a fiery socialist leader, accused the U.S. of economic imperialism and of trying to undermine Venezuela's sovereignty. He was convinced the CIA wanted to topple him. And after surviving a 2002 coup attempt that he claimed was US-backed, anti-Americanism became central to his rhetoric. Venezuela's national media started portraying the U.S. as a greedy empire, exploiting Latin America. Sanctions under the Bush, Obama, and especially Trump administrations only deepened the divide. The U.S. supported opposition leader Juan Guaido, refusing to recognize President Nicolas Maduro, which many Venezuelans saw as foreign interference. Combine that with crippling sanctions that worsened the economic crisis, and it's easy to understand why many Venezuelans associate the U.S. with suffering, inflation, and loss of dignity. Number 4. Russia. Russia's animosity toward the United States is a Cold War that never truly ended. While the Berlin Wall fell and communism collapsed, the distrust lived on. For Russia, the U.S. symbolizes humiliation. After the Soviet Union dissolved, America pushed NATO expansion right up to Russia's borders. something Moscow sees as a betrayal of verbal promises made in the early 90s. Add to that the US's support for pro-Western movements in Ukraine, Georgia, and other former Soviet states, and you've got a recipe for tension. In Russian media, the US is portrayed as an aggressive, manipulative power seeking to dominate the world through color revolutions, regime change, and military might. The 2014 annexation of Crimea and the sanctions that followed widened the gap. And with the war in Ukraine, US arms, aid, and leadership in the West's response have fueled full-scale anti-American rhetoric in Russia. It's not just geopolitical, it's personal. For many Russians, the US is the architect of their post-Soviet pain. Number 5. Iraq. Iraq's hatred toward the US is tied to a war that changed everything. In 2003, the US invaded Iraq under the pretext of weapons of mass destruction, which were never found. What followed was years of occupation, civil war, and chaos. Tens of thousands of civilians died. The country's infrastructure crumbled. Sectarian violence erupted. And through it all, many Iraqis blamed not just their own leaders, but the US for creating the disaster. While some welcomed the fall of Saddam Hussein, many others came to see the US as an occupying force, not a liberator. American troops were targeted. Anti-US militias formed. And even after withdrawal, America's footprint remained through airstrikes, drone campaigns, and political meddling. For many Iraqis, the US brought promises of freedom, but left behind a legacy of pain, instability, and broken trust. Number 6. Pakistan. US-Pakistan relations have always been a complicated dance. Allies on paper, but distrusting behind the scenes. The real shift happened after September 11th, when Pakistan became a key partner in America's war on terror. But US drone strikes in Pakistan's tribal areas killed hundreds of civilians, sparking outrage and resentment. Then came the 2011 killing of Osama bin Laden in Abbottabad, a covert US operation on Pakistani soil without informing its government. Many Pakistanis felt violated. Some even believed it proved the US didn't trust Pakistan at all. Add to that Washington's growing closeness with India, Pakistan's arch-rival, and the relationship became even more strained. In Pakistan's political circles, media, and public discourse, America is often portrayed as a manipulative power that uses and discards allies. Many see the US as a self-interested force, fueling regional chaos while pretending to be a peacekeeper. Number 7. Cuba. Just 90 miles from Florida, Cuba has stood as one of America's fiercest critics for over 6 decades. The hostility dates back to 1959, when Fidel Castro's communist revolution ousted a US-backed dictator. Soon after, the US imposed a crippling trade embargo that still exists today. Then came the Bay of Pigs invasion, a failed CIA operation to overthrow Castro, followed by the Cuban Missile Crisis, which brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. For decades, Cubans have lived under economic hardship, much of which the government blames on US policies. Generations have grown up hearing that America is the enemy and that US imperialism is responsible for their suffering. Even when diplomatic ties warmed under Obama, Trump-era restrictions reignited the feud. In Cuban propaganda, the US is a symbol of capitalist greed and oppression. In the streets, there's a deep-rooted sense of national pride and resistance, fueled by a long history of standing up to their powerful neighbor. Number 8. China. China doesn't openly hate the US, but beneath the surface, there's a growing rivalry and resentment. As China rises as a global power, many in its leadership see the US as trying to contain it. Trade wars, tech bans, and restrictions on Chinese companies like Huawei are seen as deliberate moves to halt China's growth. Then there's Taiwan, a red line for Beijing. U.S. arms sales and political support for Taiwan are viewed as blatant interference in what China considers its internal affairs. Add to that U.S. naval patrols in the South China Sea, criticisms of China's human rights record, and accusations over COVID-19's origins, and you get a narrative of Western hypocrisy and aggression. Chinese state media paints the U.S. as arrogant, decaying, and desperate to hold on to power. For many Chinese citizens, the U.S. is seen less as a role model and more as an obstacle to national pride and unity. Number 9. Turkey. Turkey is a NATO ally, but the relationship with the U.S. has grown cold and complicated. One major point of tension? The U.S. support for Kurdish militias in Syria, which Turkey considers terrorists. To Ankara, this feels like betrayal from a supposed ally. Then there's the issue of Fethullah Gulen, a Turkish cleric living in the U.S., whom President Erdogan accuses of orchestrating a failed 2016 coup. The U.S. refusal to extradite him has been a major sore spot. Turkish media often blames the U.S. for economic crises, currency drops, and meddling in internal affairs. While many Turks still admire American culture and education, there's a growing wave of nationalism that sees the U.S. as a bully, disrespectful of Turkish sovereignty, and obsessed with control. The relationship is no longer about friendship, it's about strategic survival. Number 10. Palestine. Perhaps no people feel more abandoned by the U.S. than the Palestinians. For decades, the U.S. has backed Israel militarily, politically, and financially, regardless of Israeli policies in the West Bank and Gaza. Many Palestinians see the U.S. not as a neutral broker for peace, but as an enabler of occupation. Every airstrike, every land seizure, every demolished home is viewed through the lens of U.S.-supplied weapons and diplomatic shielding. Trump's decision to move the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, a city Palestinians also claim, was seen as a brutal dismissal of their rights. Even humanitarian aid was slashed. To most Palestinians, the U.S. doesn't just support Israel, it actively empowers the system that denies them freedom. In protests, in classrooms, and in poetry, America is often the silent hand behind their suffering. In a world of alliances and enemies, one truth remains. Hatred doesn't emerge in a vacuum. It's shaped by history, blood, betrayal, and power. For some, America stands for hope, but for others, it stands for everything they've lost. If we want peace, we must understand the pain behind the politics. Which country on this list surprised you the most? Drop a comment below. Subscribe for more global insights, and remember, the world is more complicated than we're told.